Hi class, today we're going to talk about chapter 13, part 1, Amenhotep and King Tut from the Story of the World. In this video, we're going to review chapter 13, part 2, talk about Amenhotep III, Amenhotep IV, and King Tut. So in your chapter, you learn about Amenhotep IV and King Tut. I'm just adding Amenhotep III in there because I want to. Chapter 13.2 review. So in this chapter, you read about two pharaohs. The first pharaoh you read about is Amenhotep IV. He reigned in 1350 BC, and he was the first Egyptian monotheist. He decided that Amun and the rest of the Egyptian gods did not exist, and the Egyptians were completely horrified. They believed that the gods controlled every part of their lives. They were polytheistic. So they worshiped, and Amenhotep IV worshipped Aten instead. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So he closes all the temples of the other gods, and he made the priests stop performing rituals to the Egyptian gods, and he builds new temples for Aten. When Amenhotep IV dies, the people just completely rebel. They close the temple of Aten and they reopen all the other temples. They went back to worshiping all the old gods of Egypt, and they erased Amenhotep's name from the records. And they move out of his city that he had built for Aten, and they let it fall to ruins. Then the other pharaoh that you read about is King Tut. He becomes a pharaoh at the age of 7, and he is someone who helps wipe out the name of Aten. We don't know a lot about him because, during his reign, we don't know a lot about him because he dies at the age of 18. However, he's one of the most famous pharaohs because he was buried in the Valley of Kings, which was a place made because of tomb robbers. It had all these caves and passageways. Nobody knows it was there. Nobody knew that it was there. His tomb was there for thousands of years. However, Howard Carter discovers it in 3,000 years later when he's looking for tombs. He finds Hatshepsut's tomb, and then he goes and finds King Tut's tomb, or King Tutankhaten's tomb, and it's filled with gold and treasures, and there's series of rooms linked with hallways, and he finds his body under many layers of coffins, which is why, even though King Tut dies at the age of 18 and maybe doesn't accomplish a ton during his reign, he is one of the most famous pharaohs in Egyptian history. And some people believe that there was a curse on his tomb. So let's talk about Amenhotep III. So he is the third pharaoh after Tutmosis III, and I just add that in there because when I'm studying history and someone's just like, and this pharaoh, I want to know, chronologically, when you're studying history, where does this person fit? So I'm going to tell you. Remember, we studied the new kingdom of Egypt, and it starts with Ahmose expelling the Hyksos. So we have Ahmose, Amenhotep I, who's childless, gives his throne to Thutmose I, who's a general. So we have Thutmose I, Thutmose II, Thutmose III. And Thutmose III can't reign for a while because of Queen Hatshepsut. Eventually, Thutmose III reigns, and then Amenhotep III is the third pharaoh after Thutmose III. So we have Thutmose III, Pharaoh 1, Pharaoh 2, and Pharaoh 3 is Amenhotep III. So Amenhotep III, I just wanted to talk about him because he is one of the most successful and powerful rulers of Egypt. Joshua J. Mark in the Ancient History Encyclopedia, great resource, by the way, it's an online. Look it up if you have the chance. He says Amenhotep III reigned over Egypt at one of its highest points culturally, politically, and economically. His reign is among the most opulent in the history of Egypt, and he consistently used his wealth in dealings with other countries to coax them into doing what he wanted. He maintained a stable rule of the country, expanded its borders, and devoted himself to the arts and building projects. Many of the most impressive Egyptian monuments come from his reign. And another reason I wanted to add him is because he had some strange hobbies, and I just wanted to talk about them with you. So here's a couple of things he did. One thing he did is he killed 102 lions in the first 10 years of his reign. And another thing he did, excuse me, is that he killed 56 wild bulls in a single day. Sounds impressive, except the bulls were in an enclosure for the pharaoh, and you can just kind of see how peaceful, how prosperous Egypt had to be in order for the pharaoh to be like, oh, today I'm going to kill 56 bulls, put them in an enclosure so I can just go and do this, right? Like, Egypt had to be doing really well for a pharaoh to have this kind of hobby. Also, just looking at what he built a lake a mile long so his wife could boat in comfort. So she had this boat and she was like, I would like to boat in comfort, my darling. And he was just like, I shall build you a lake. So he just does. He builds a new palace for himself. He builds the temple of Amun at Karnak, which we talked about last video. He builds a huge mortuary temple for himself and 2 enormous statues of himself as well, as you can see here. So how did he die? We look at his mummy and see that his teeth were badly abscessed, and so the theory goes that maybe he developed an infection from his teeth. But Susan Wise Bauer says, during his extraordinary long reign, Egypt had reached an unprecedented peace and prosperity. So under Amenhotep III, Egypt is just very, very peaceful and prosperous and growing. People have time for leisure activities like killing 56 bulls in an enclosure in a single day. However, during this time, the priests of Amun are also growing in power. So if Egypt is peaceful and prosperous, they're going to be prosperous as well. So they're growing in power. Again, some are more wealthy than the pharaoh. Some own more land than the pharaoh. And because they are so wealthy and they are growing in power, and again, gods are an important thing, and people communicate with the gods through priests, and the priests have the power of being able to say, like, this is what a god said. And so they're growing in power and they're becoming a threat. Which leads us to Amenhotep IV, the first Egyptian monotheist. So Amenhotep IV changed from a polytheist to a monotheist. So a polytheist is someone who worships many gods, and a monotheist is someone who worships one god. When we studied Abraham, we said that he was the first monotheist. When you study ancient ancient cultures and ancient, I guess, religions too, pretty much ancient people groups are all polytheistic. They worship many gods. But Abraham was different. He is called by God and he becomes a monotheist, and his family becomes the nation of Israel. And then we have Amenhotep IV, who in a very, very polytheistic society, Egypt has been this way for thousands of years. He suddenly comes out and says, guys, I'm a monotheist. So you can see why the Egyptians were just horrified. So instead of worshiping the many Egyptian gods, he chose to worship Aten, the sun disk, and he starts a new religion in Egypt. He changes his name from Amenhotep I to Akhenaten, the worshiper of the sun. So here's a little explanation on how this whole thing worked with Aten and the other gods. So Susan Wise Bauer says the disk of the sun itself was called the Aten. Okay, so the physical disk in the sky that we call the sun was called the Aten in Egypt, and had not gone unrecognized in the past. It was simply one aspect of the sun god Ra. So you have the sun god Ra in human form, and one aspect of him was the Aten. But in the hands of Amenhotep IV, the sun disk became something new. Rather than a god being, or rather than a god shaped like a mortal being, as Osiris and Horus and Ra himself were, the sun disk was an abstract representation of the divine itself, the manifestation of a single power. In its glare, the other gods of the pantheon vanished. The sun was not merely the chief power, it was the only power. The gods of the Egyptian pantheon had wives and consorts. Aten was alone and self-sufficient. The gods of the Egyptian pantheon appeared in the shapes of mortal beings. Aten had no form. The gods of the Egyptian pantheon had stories. Aten had no stories at all. So it's like almost the polar opposite of what had been for thousands of years. In year 5 of his reign, Akhenaten said he received a divine word to build a place for Aten. So he chooses a location that's never been built on before. It wasn't a good location. It was a dry place. But he says this is the new capital for Aten, and he names it Akhetaten. So what happened to all the other gods as he decides that Aten is the only god? So his orders were for the name of Amun to be completely wiped out, covered with plaster, inscribed with the name of Aten instead. The new temples were then built to Aten, and all the temples to the other gods were closed. Now remember who's gaining power right now, the priests of Amun. The temple was closed. And Susan Wise Bauer says the priests were not replaced. Aten needed no priests, no religious bureaucracy that might thwart the pharaoh's aims. Neither the god nor the god's representatives on earth would tolerate shared power. So basically that's saying that if you have the priests of Amun or the priests of these other gods in the pantheon of Egyptian gods, Aten didn't need these priests to tell people or to tell the pharaoh what the kings or what the gods said, or to sacrifice him or worship him. Aten was just alone, self-sufficient, and could not share power with anybody. So my question to you is, why do you think Akhenaten changed his religion? Right? Because that's a legitimate thing that we need to ask. And I want to talk to you guys about this so much, but write this answer in complete sentences in your notes and we will discuss it in class. Why do you think he changed religion? Was it authentic? Did he have other motives? Think it through. Okay, so towards the end of his reign, there was a plague that spread in Egypt. It was in the 14th year of his reign. And this lends itself to Egypt being going into poverty. In Akhenaten's family, 2 wives die. He had no sons, so he takes his oldest girl and he marries her to a distant cousin, and this cousin is then named the heir. However, his daughter, the princess, dies, and then Akhenaten dies shortly after, and then the heir reigns for a few days before he then dies. So plague was a not good thing. Which leads us to Tutankhaten, also known as King Tut. So Tutankhaten is named king. It's unclear whether he is of royal blood or not, but he did grow up in the palace, and he's very young when he is crowned pharaoh. So as a child, Susan Wise Bauer says that when he was a kid, Tutankhaten was surrounded by advisors and courtiers who had watched Egypt lose hold of the north and battle plagues while Akhenaten built his temples to Aten. So he's like as a kid and he's watching Egypt fall apart, change religion. I'm sure people were so upset by this change in religion. These temples are being closed. Egypt, the structure of Egypt as he knows it is being changed, and there's a plague and they're losing territory, and Akhenaten is just building his temple, and he's seeing this happen. Continues, he had himself seen the royal family die off one by one. The throne must have seemed like a death sentence. Now he sat directly beneath the wrath of the old gods. Okay, because people believed that in worshiping this new god Aten and doing off with all the other gods, I'm sure they were like, oh, they are punishing us. The plague has come because we are being punished, and now he sits on the throne under the wrath of the old gods. So then what did Tutankhaten do? So in opposition to Akhenaten, he renames himself Tutankhamun. So again, replacing the Aten with the Amun. And Akhenaten's name is removed from monuments and reliefs. And like guys, we've seen this before. Tutmosis III was so angry at Hatshepsut, removes all of her names. Akhenaten doesn't like Amun, so he removes the god's name. And now it's just happening again. Akhenaten's statues are smashed, and he renames the city of Aten Amarna. So we don't know a lot about King Tut because he dies at the age of 18. It's unexpected. We don't know what happens. Possibly he died because he was hit by an arrow, but we do know he was buried with great magnificence. Probably the way that he was buried was similar to the other pharaohs who were buried at this time. Egypt is very wealthy and very affluent, However, unlike these other pharaohs, his tomb laid untouched until 1922. So King Tut is buried in the Valley of Kings, and so let's just talk about the Valley of Kings for a little bit. The Valley of Kings was used for 500 years as a burial place for the pharaohs, and it's a burial place for 18th through 20th dynasty pharaohs. Remember that the New Kingdom of Egypt starts with the 18th dynasty. The Valley of Kings is where the tombs are concealed for fear of tomb robbers. And I just want to point out just how things have changed from the Old Kingdom to the New Kingdom, because in the Old Kingdom of Egypt, you have these pharaohs who were like building these huge pyramids and showing off their power and showing off their wealth, and then the next pharaoh would come along and say, I'm going to build mine better than yours, I'm going to build mine bigger than yours. And now shift to, hey, let's get buried in a place where no one can find us, and we can conceal all of our treasures so that nobody knows that we're buried there. Anyway, I just think that's interesting. However, most of the tombs were either robbed, okay, so some of them are robbed, and then most of them are stripped of their treasure. And when they're stripped of their treasure, the Egyptian palace and the government takes this treasure and puts it back into the Egyptian treasury when they need it. And so it's stripped of their treasure, and then the mummies in the 21st dynasty are taken in order to protect them from robbers. So I read that they took the mummies from these different tombs and they put them in, I think, 3 different tombs. And some of them were just kind of tossed in a chaotic order, and to the point where some of them are still unidentified. Like, we don't know who the mummy is because of this. Even though I think it was wise that they chose to protect them in that way, it would have been cool if they labeled them a little bit better. Anyway, so with all of this happening, with like the Egyptian government taking the treasure out and using it again, or some tombs being robbed, or people like, we got to protect these mummies, and then dumping them into a few tombs, only King Tut's tomb remained hidden and untouched. And I think it's so cool that we had one left. And so here is the Valley of Kings. And here are some of the treasures inside King Tut's tomb. If you want to learn more about King Tut's tomb, his artifacts are in, the artifacts from his tomb are in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. And I'll link it down below, but you can do a virtual tour of all the artifacts in the museum. And it's really cool, so check it out. There's also tons of videos and things like that on his discovery, and I will link those down below as well. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.